Thank you very much, Chaitra, and also Shalini, who's unfortunately not here just now, for inviting me to give this talk. So good evening to all of you, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you this evening. While I was asked to divide this talk into two parts, one more personal and the other more academic, actually this has been very difficult for me to do. So I think there will be overlaps between the two parts. And the reason is, I think that the methodology and the feminist epistemology from which I come, or my approach to research, there is a recognition of the personal as political. So the writing and analysis that we do is political. It has a political objective in that we acknowledge our individual subjectivities and approach to knowledge. And in several ways, I feel that this is a much more honest way of doing research, because we make clear what our assumptions are, and these are related to our own life and experience of the environment around us. So rather than saying that assumptions are common, or given these assumptions, actually here we are making our assumptions much clearer. And this approach is also central to the way I address climate change, which is the second part of my talk, because the determinants and drivers are not just physical and social, but also they are deeply embedded in people's lives, cultures, and how they understand the world. The way they adapt is really in relation to, what are the norms, how they can behave or live in a particular environment. So the picture on here is not somewhere where I've worked a lot, but I think this picture will be familiar to a lot of you. It is a picture of women hugging the trees in the Chipko movement in Garhwal Himalayas, which was recently again brought to the light with the passing of Sundarlal Bahuguna. And I bring this picture for both personal again and political reasons. Personally, I did my graduation in history at Delhi University. And when I was an undergraduate student, the first major floods in the Alaknanda had just taken place. And this set in motion the so-called environmental movement, Chipko movement in the Garhwal Himalayas. It brought to light the decimation of the forests that had led to the floods. And the picture that was portrayed was of women coming out and hugging the trees in order to protect them from the acts of the companies. Well, the picture is symbolic and used to demonstrate women's attachment to nature. This has also been challenged. I think in a very early article, the late Anil Agarwal, he wrote in the New Scientist, I think in the mid-70s itself, or very early on, that in the actual Chipko movement in the Garhwal Himalayas at that time, no woman actually hugged a tree, but they did have power because of a historical reason of male migration and a woman-dominant economy, which when they saw a threat and they just opposed it verbally, even this was enough. They didn't actually need to engage in this act. So the picture then can be interpreted as a sign actually of weakness rather than a power in the local context, as it reflects women actually having to physically hold a tree and their voice not being enough to stop the destruction of their environment. During this period, actually, I participated in an eco-development camp in Gopeshwar. And this really opened my eyes to the issues and problems confronting these women, their gradual alienation from the environment, but at the same time, the lack of adequate delivery of basic services, including education, health, and so on. Observing Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who I would call an organic intellectual in Gramscian terms, that I realized the importance that along with protest, you also need reconstruction, you need positive action. And this was a philosophy that I further imbibed during my work with Seva, which I will come to next. I realized also the importance of using science and scholarship for the public good. So, I did complete my degree in history in Delhi University, and I think I gained a lot from it because it provided very useful tools for analysis. In development studies, where I am now located, we often ignore history, but the historical method can provide us with deep insights into change. What is change, both positive and negative? What is the change we want, and from which perspective are we looking at change? What are the barriers? What are the facilitators? So the picture on the right is actually from an archaeological dig at Gangaikonda Choyapuram in Tanjavur district in Tamil Nadu, which I visited during my graduation period. I learned Sanskrit. I was very interested in archaeology. And I also learned Sanskrit, read historical texts, some inscriptions and so on. And very interestingly, I think a lot of them actually covered issues of development. They covered issues of water management, the rains, governance systems, taxation policies, social relations, and so on. Anyway, I decided by the end of my graduation that was very interested in development. I think it was partly the CHIPCO experience. And I went to the IRMA, the Institute of Rural Management at Anand, to pick up some formal skills. This was 1983. And at that time, management, like science, other sciences, was a very male discipline. And one of my mentors there, Dr. Kamla Chaudhary, she was a Gandhian, but she was also a management expert. And she said to me that there are so few women in management discipline that why don't you actually give support to a women's organization? And that's how I ended up joining SEWA, or Self-Employed Women's Association, based in Ahmedabad. I was there for a while. I moved to Bhopal because in 1984, December, the Bhopal gas tragedy had taken place. There was lots of money coming in for reconstruction and relief in Bhopal. Very few NGOs at that time with capacity to really manage these resources. So Ilaben suggested that, having just completed a management degree, I could help with this process. And it was, again, a very interesting learning experience for me, because various enterprises were set up with no sense actually of women's skills, needs, or problems. It was very much donor-driven, organization-driven. After spending a few months there, we moved to Jabalpur to organize women BD workers into cooperatives. And one of the early steps we took was to set up a bank branch of UCO Bank in the premises of the cooperative. This is the picture on the left, for women to save and take loans. And this, again, was a real eye-opener, because at that time, I think for me, for the first time, actually, it raised issues of gender. Because many men, BD making is really a household enterprise. Many men were also engaged in this household enterprise. They came to us to ask to join the cooperative, to ask for work and fair wages. But because we were part of SEWA, it was a women's organization, we had to refuse. But with this bank, which was under Women's Own, directly they were engaging with the bank. Many loans women were taking independently were actually to support their husbands and sons. So I understood really that women are not working in a vacuum, but are socially embedded. And we need to look at and address power relations across different levels. I then had the opportunity in the early 90s to work with the literacy campaigns in Tamil Nadu as a research fellow at the National Institute of Adult Education. In Pudukkottai district, it was very interesting that apart from literacy, numeracy, awareness, and functionality, the district collector introduced mobility. And by this, they really meant riding cycles as a part of the campaign. And of course, there were different objectives. One is that women's task was collection of water, the picture on the left, and the cycles helped them save time in terms of water collection. After about 5 or 6 years, late 90s, we did a review of what was the situation in Pudukkottai, and there was a major structural change. That while workloads didn't really reduce, women were still doing a lot of work, but women's self-worth in their own eyes and in the eyes of the community had greatly improved, as women were able to support and play useful roles during emergencies, taking someone to the hospital, dropping someone at school, and so on. And even though women continued to have relatively less access to bicycles, this didn't seem to matter much to them. I think the point had been made. And I think here we saw real structural change as a result of this kind of widespread, seeing women on the roads doing cycling for various kinds of household tasks, because Tamil Nadu then invested in water taps in all the villages, public transport was improved, and women didn't really need to use bicycles to fetch water, for instance. Even at that time, we confronted the issue of rights to land. In that case, the rights to stone quarries in Pudukkottai, which had been assigned to the women's group by the district collector. There was a lot of opposition to this, as several contractors felt they had historically invested in developing these quarries, and handing them over to women's groups was not fair. We organized these women into a federation, yet the opposition was strong and it was hard to sustain. there were many constraints that women faced in their daily lives. This was again a learning that the barriers that women face are not only at the household level. We often think of patriarchy as a very familial thing, but the barriers that women face are also in the labor markets, also vis-a-vis state and across institutional levels. So they needed to negotiate at all these levels. My deeper exploration of women's relationship to resources, particularly land, and my interest in natural resources and management and so on, was really in the Santhal Parganas. It was at that time Bihar when I started working there in the mid-90s. And now, of course, it's a part of Jharkhand. I have a lot of stories from there, but I cannot narrate them all. But what it did show to me was that women didn't relate to land in the same way as men. It was not really considered as an individual asset, something for which necessarily a legal title was needed, but something to fulfill their livelihood needs, social responsibilities. It also gave them social legitimacy as equals. Production was joint. And in many ways, even now, I think though there has been changes, tribal societies in India continue to reflect at least a greater degree or some degree of reciprocity. Although it is asymmetric, it is not equal. But women at that time were keen to preserve this reciprocity, which was a degree of male responsibility towards the household in favor of claiming independent rights to land. So while there were a lot of calls for independent rights to land, women said, if we get our own thing, then men will even stop doing what they're doing. And we want to be families. We want the men to also take responsibility and interest in the household. The annual hunt on the right, the picture on the right, was a space for collective problem solving, and women were debarred from attending this. Yet they were able to influence decisions of their leaders through highlighting the collective interests they were meant to uphold. It was also within the political context of Jharkhand movement that the whole logic for the separate state of Jharkhand from Bihar was that there was much more attention to a collective control and management of natural resources, land, water, and forests, compared to the more feudal or non-tribal society. Of course, when all failed, the courts remain, the picture on the left. However, justice, even if delivered, was hard to implement on the ground without social support. So these institutions are very closely linked to each other. And this has been very important understanding of the link between the individual and the collective in my own research pathway. This work on the ground, I think by this time, it also showed to me that because of these connections across institutional levels and scales, that there is also need for advocacy at more national and global levels. So I gradually started getting involved much more in global fora. This was from 2000 and 2010 at the World Conference on Education for All at Dakar. And 10 years later, there was again a World Conference on Education for All at Dakar. And more recently, as in the introduction, in the science policy interface of food systems and food security. And finally, I think I want to conclude the first section of my own journey with some reference to my family and my family background. I think this is important to acknowledge the trajectory that I carved. My father is a renowned agricultural scientist. We grew up at the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in IRI, where he was in Delhi, where he was the director. And of course, our childhood was spent visiting his labs in the genetics department, but also farmers' fields. Many eminent scientists came home and engaged in debate and discussion for long hours, whether it was Vikram Sarabhai, Norman Borlaug, C.V. Raman, many others. We were all young children then. But this was a great, the family atmosphere was one very much of scientific inquiry and debate, and also problem solving. My mother, her picture is not here, but is an educationist in her own right. And the book on the left was really, for me, a tribute to her very wide contributions in the field of gender, early childhood, as well as theatre. She has deep concern for systemic inequities. And actually, in every institution that my father was at, she set up something for the underprivileged, starting with the Nehru Experimental Center at IRI. She was a high school teacher, and then she moved to the education of the young child, working for many years with children at the mobile creches for migrant construction construction workers. So our household was live with debates, books, encouragement to diverse fields, music, theater. And parents basically encouraged us to explore our own pathways. But I think what was very important was the values and concerns for the public good, for society, for humanity, for women, and for a positive take or optimism in terms of finding solutions rather than a pessimism that we are not going to get anywhere. So I think this is something that has really been with me. So in moving now from this background for almost 15 years, I think after Irma, I was an activist and I worked on the ground with these various projects. As I moved to academia by the late 90s, early 2000s, I think for me, this was an important question which I struggled with of what constitutes good science. And I think there are three sort of core areas. The first is really Nehru's call for a scientific temper, a spirit of questioning, inquiry, and observation. But from here, it moves beyond this to really issues of power and privilege, of challenging hegemonies of power. And I think in recent times, every day almost in the newspaper, we see a controversy, especially in the context of COVID, that, there's call for proposals to study the curative properties of urine of indigenous cows. And I think there was a letter sent by 400 scientists opposing this call. I think the main issue is not for science is not to be pre-decided or to privilege particular beliefs, but rather to be open in its inquiry. So even if you're going to study the urine of cows or bovines or livestock and its properties, I think there is nothing to restrict it to indigenous cows. We should look at a range of cattle and livestock, because in villages particularly, people have buffaloes, various kinds of goats, bovines, and so on, which are also play very important roles in enhancing soil fertility, for example. So we need to be open in terms of the questions we ask and recognize that, especially where certain kinds of hegemonic power is coming into play, we need to challenge or question that. And the third very important point is to very intentionally recognize diversity and issues of equity that arise as a result of these unequal power relations. Its ability to shape discourse or narrative gives science immense power. As Russell Einstein said way back in 1954, that science provides us with social choice for whom and for what. So the atom bomb they were talking about, the atomic energy can be used for good of the people, but it can also be used as a bomb to destroy humanity. And I think this has been really, for me, my approach to my research, to seek scholarship that promotes gender, but also wider social equality. And this is also, of course, the basis of feminist epistemologies and methodologies. And just two very, interesting little anecdotes before moving to the second part, which is not really linked to my own work, but this is an example of Pierre and Marie Curie. And it's very interesting that way back in 1903, actually, Pierre Curie refused to take the Nobel Prize until and unless it was given jointly to Marie Curie. So this is more than 100 years ago. But I think it's interesting. I just last week saw a film, which some of you might have seen, which was put out by the Indian National Science Academy Women and Science panel, called Picture a Scientist of 2020, which was about the continued maleness of scientific institutions and spaces. And this film was about Mary Hopkins and a group of other scientists at MIT in Boston. And they spearheaded the report on gender equality which finally sort of came to light in 2018, just 2 years ago. So what happened with Marie Curie, of course, was that after Pierre's death, she did get a second Nobel Prize, but she was also criticized a lot for her personal relationships. So I think this is one constraint also that women face when they are doing fieldwork or when they're doing any kind of research. I think more so in fieldwork, that while men's personal lives are rarely interrogated, for women, this is always the case. As bearers of culture, they're always in the spotlight. Their primary role is seen as that of homemakers. So irrespective of their careers, they're responsible for care of the home, children sick. And this is an additional layer of constraint to others, such as lack of labs, equipment, working environment, and so on. Again, very visible during the pandemic, where work from home has become almost impossible for a lot of women with young children or with elderly people to look after, to undertake. And I think this is just a little example of even within these high levels, I think Pierre Curie was an exception, because a couple of 50 years later in 1960s, even though Rosalind Franklin's images with X-ray crystallography were critical to the discussion of the discovery of the double helix DNA, but she was excluded from the Nobel Prize on the excuse that she was not alive. So I think issues of recognition really remain, even till now, very critical for women scientists. And this is a wonderful paper by C.V. Sheshadri, written for the Indian National Science Academy, again, way back in 1993, where the paper is called Equity is Good Science. And he raises several important questions about science and its technological applications, and especially this conflict between the modern Western paradigm and the indigenous. And I'm raising it here because it's very important when looking at particularly women's knowledges or gender relations within science. And, in the field of nutrition and food, where I've been working on, for instance, something like vitamin A supplementation or tablets, I mean, we are very much driven by Western research. Why not pay the same attention, for instance, to local foods? I recently read in the newspaper about purple varieties of sweet potato, which are very rich in iron and zinc, found in Odisha. The research on orange flesh sweet potato was awarded the World Food Prize in 2016. This research was conducted in Africa. But why are we not focusing on some of these within our agricultural and other research institutions? So indigenous women, again, have knowledge, but this knowledge is not seen as science. So several questions he raises about the science form an exploitative body of knowledge. Are we really open to kind of land use patterns or cropping choices that women may suggest? Can universal rights be assured? Again, this is a debate in terms of distributive justice. We are seeing it in the context of vaccines, that for COVID, that, this whole discriminatory mechanism, and it's only 2 days ago that a sort of free vaccine policy, universal free vaccine policy, was announced even in India. Okay, so let me move to the second part, which actually will be quite quick, because I will draw on some of these insights from what I have been talking about: women's agency, gendered work, and the climate crisis. So characterizing women's agency, I think what we found in our research, is that this is something which is very key to realizing adaptive capacity, but it really remains understudied. So drawing on feminist arguments to move beyond very simplistic framings of women as either active, either as victims of development or perpetrators of inequality, I think we started looking at agency really in a much more nuanced way, as the ability to make meaningful choices and also strategic decisions that affect one's own life. And some of this comes from the work of Naila Kabir. It can therefore take multiple forms, from bargaining, negotiation of different ways across different scales, and so on, depending on the resources that people have at their command. And it is driven by multiple factors which act in combination to each other. Therefore, the outcomes also are not the same. And this is because we are different people. We are not homogeneous. So women themselves have intersecting identities of age, class, ethnicity, marital status, education, and so on. The kind of agency they have shifts in relation to their roles. So while in the domain of reproduction or domestic domain, they may have a lot of power, but when it comes to choosing what job to go, where to go, and so on, it may be much more constrained. These are embedded in social power relations, which are of course dynamic and change over time, including with changes in the life conditions of women themselves. And they are contextual, located in particular contexts. And finally, I think the social, structural, and institutional dynamics, in particular, ranging from the household and community levels to markets and state, and the rules and norms they establish, interact, and intersect with each other, often intensify or reproduce inequalities. In the context of climate change action, while some research explores the role of social capital, especially women's groups, in supporting women's agency, a nuanced institutional analysis that looks at the intersection or the interaction between these different levels largely remains missing in this literature. So I, in my work, actually build on some of the frameworks around gender justice, starting with the interaction between agency and structures and institutions, which also comes from social theory, from the work of Anthony Giddens, and this is well established, but also building on frameworks of gender justice. I identify sort of 4 broad areas which need to be strengthened by enabling women's agency in order to achieve the outcomes that we want in terms of adaptation to climate change, reduced vulnerability, food security, improved livelihoods, and so on. And these are some of them, which basically comes from my experience. I think I already mentioned very early on the reciprocity in terms of social relations, the recognition of contributions, of identities, of rights. Redistribution is very important in terms of redistributive justice of both resources and of the labor. And I will just explain why I say this, including care labor. And finally, what is the representation voice across institutions and scales. These are very important for creating an enabling environment for all women, for their, not just their survival, but also for stability and also longer term sustainability. So I think if we look at the whole area of labor, and we recognize in India from quite a long time that women are working in agriculture and so on. But actually, if you look at the extent of it, but we still see them mainly as household helpers. And in our statistics also, they are recorded as unpaid household helpers. So we did a study of 60 households in 2 sites. Actually, one is in Vidarbha in Maharashtra and in Koraput in Odisha, across seasons, planting, harvesting, and lean season, time use, as well as diet surveys. And the total amount of work which we recorded, of all work conducted by men and women, that 56%, so actually more than 50% of the total burden of work is performed by women. Within agriculture, it was very interesting that we often think that women do all the domestic work and men are the farmers. But actually, men were doing almost equal, about 80% of what women, were doing almost 80% of what men were doing in terms of agricultural work. And also in terms of domestic work, of course, they were doing 95% of all domestic and care work. So we found that during the peak seasons of planting and harvesting, particularly, women face time deficits for care work or domestic work because the agriculture had to be done. It's very seasonal. It can't be left. And especially so for women from landless and marginal households. So the time that they had for cooking, feeding, etc., declined by almost 30%, which of course has impacts for well-being, for nutrition, for food security, but also for women's own health, that in this season, in the peak seasons, they encounter greater seasonal weight loss, almost 3 to 4% of body weight than men. There's reduced consumption, but also much more intensive activity. But it's not just labor. I think we move beyond physical labor to also think about knowledges. And this is where science comes in, that we have these binary constructs about scientific versus local or traditional knowledge. So scientific is enhanced productivity, inputs, extension services, top down, and so on. And somehow indigenous is about diversity, irregularity, wildness, and so on. And in this whole process, I think what becomes very important is that when we make these kind of binary constructs, then we actually take away the power of the local. For instance, crop diversity, for example, we say is kind of messy. It is not giving higher yields, so we should go for monocropping in order to produce higher yields. But of course, these systems are interconnected, as yields in one crop may imply a diminishing of water levels or soil fertility for other crops. So many of these complex mixed cropping systems actually maintained a balance between nature, people, and food, which is central to sustainability, particularly so in the context of a climate crisis, because of the seasonal production cycles can get disrupted by droughts or floods. If you have a single crop, if you have a greater diversity, that itself is a strategy for adaptation or greater resilience. Yet we find that this is not easily accepted, and an artificial dualism is perpetrated between science and farmers practice. While I'm not glorifying everything that people do as ideal, there's clearly scope for improvement. There is scope for lab scientists to work along with these indigenous women and men. But I think what I want to point out here is that maintaining some of this dichotomy or dualism is also a result of power and privilege of vested interests. So in Koraput, for instance, these pictures are from there. Eucalyptus plantations have been promoted in the uplands to apparently enhance incomes and security for the local people and minimize the amount of labor with children going to school and to hostels and so on. However, this has led to a destruction of soil, but also water in the uplands. And these soils really, once they are planted with eucalyptus, they can't really be used for crop cultivation. Again, especially for the kind of pulses, millets, and vegetables that women were growing on these upland crops. So one can really ask that, is it a power issue, or is it really trying to build resilience, or is it actually enhancing vulnerability? What is going on here in terms of this contestation of knowledge? And I think this was a short perspective piece that was published that I wrote for Nature Food, which was titled "The Achievement of Food and Nutrition Security in South Asia is Deeply Gendered." And this was exactly the argument in that perspective piece, that if we want to address poor nutrition outcomes or food security, then we have to address the whole gamut of environmental, social, and institutional systems. So you have to look at, devaluation of women's work, forms of structural violence, low sex ratios, but also the environmental factors, the social environment in terms of the nature of gender roles, relationships, access to resources, but also opportunities within agriculture, and the institutional environment, including all forms of violence. And here, structural violence is also things like exclusion from Kisan credit cards, exclusion from cooperative membership, no social protection, and so on, is all I define as forms of violence. So let me come now to just reporting on, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, on some results on climate change itself. And this was part of a consortium on adaptation at scale to climate change in semi-arid regions. And I realized the importance here of, apart from this micro level research, to also do, just like from activism on the ground to activism at the global level, even in research, the need to move from micro level to a much more aggregate or meta-synthesis level to be taken seriously. So in this consortium, we had research in India also, but I was personally working in East Africa, and these are pictures from Kenya, where we first started with a review of literature on what's going on in the ground. There was very few gendered insights, some observations about women. So our preliminary research showed us that actually in Africa, apart from gender, there are also specific age-related vulnerabilities. So we decided to do all our research, disaggregating by older men, younger men, older women, younger women. There were different issues in terms of time poverty, in terms of health and safety, in terms of support networks, but also very different aspirations that these groups had. This work led to a series of publications which examined actually different scales. From my work in Kenya on abandonment and autonomy, this was a micro-level study of the work that I did in Kenya, to much more aggregated across semi-arid regions, both in terms of vulnerabilities and in terms of managing risk, that how are communities and people actually managing risk. But we also realize, of course, as scientists, or as I said, that, my whole approach has been to link it to a larger public good, that, academic publications are fine, but we also wanted to reach out to other constituencies. So we did sort of some video films, peer-to-peer learning. We also produced a set of infographics, which were more widely available, which carried the key messages from these studies. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about this particular study, which was the Metasynthesis. It is this is the title, and it was again a joint work, and I'll say a little bit about the methodology and our findings here. And this was just a quote, I think, to bring in a different point, that science has often been thought of as the hard sciences, particularly in fields like climate change. And this was a social science article which we published in Nature Climate Change. And on 1st April this year, in an article by former editors of the journal, Jen Rickler, who was the editor, she basically specifically wrote about this article. It's a couple of paragraphs, but I just took out one quote about this paper, that it marks an important expansion of social science content represented in the journal. So in Nature Climate Change, actually, there had been very few articles from the social sciences before, because climate change has really been interpreted as a hard science. And then she says that after 10 years, Nature Climate Change, so this was a review of all papers in the last 10 years, has still room to grow in its coverage of the social sciences. And I look forward to seeing what the next 10 years might have in store. So I think the point is, I think that social science, I'm a social scientist, but I think we have to also ourselves also, with my definitions of science, I think this is a science. It is not something which is very a soft skill. It involves rigor. It involves rigorous research. So just a little bit about the paper. And the rationale for this was about, the identification, as I said, of hotspots within the climate change literature. It tends to focus on climate variables and less on societal vulnerabilities and livelihood crisis. Specifically on gender, we have several micro studies, but on the impacts of climate change on social relations, social vulnerabilities and all. But these are not really taken, they're seen as interesting cases, interesting examples, but they're not really taken on board seriously in the larger debates on climate change. So we decided to use this methodology called the qualitative comparative analysis, because it allows us to bridge between qualitative and quantitative by helping us generalize to some extent our findings without ignoring the multiple cases, strong dependence on local context. And of course, it helps pinpoint cross-case patterns based on in-depth knowledge of the researchers. It combines predictability with attention to context-specific heterogeneity. And I think this was, to our knowledge, actually, there was no other paper in this field. Probably it was novel in the studies of gender adaptation and sustainability. The way we used it to actually demonstrate what are the possible potential pathways for positive change. So how can we actually intervene? So it was more using it for solutions. So in terms of methods, I think we started off with the question of what combination of conditions can support or dampen women's agency and contribute to improved adaptation responses. We wanted to construct a typology which was not too simplistic, but we looked at a combination or configuration of risk factors that could lead to particular sets of adaptation outcomes. I think with all that I've said in the start, there's no linear correspondence. We have these multiple institutions, great heterogeneity. How do we create some kind of a typology from this very messy and complex context? So we had 25 case studies and across these hotspots. I was involved with the first consortium, but there were also 3 other consortiums working on semi-arid, on the high mountain regions and in deltas. So I think based on our knowledge, what we tried to do is that we said that, okay, if the outcome that we're looking at is women's agency, and we use certain indicators because we're trying to quantify it in terms of both material indicators of ownership of assets, control over income, but also social indicators. And then what are the influencing factors? And here we very much used an institutional lens, that you have 4, 5, 6, 7, which is really the household level, the social community level, the state level, and the labor markets or market level in terms of women's work. Condition 2, mobility and migration, is also about labor markets and market phenomena. Condition 1 was about really poverty. And condition 3 was really was about environmental stress itself. So we started with these 7, but then we found a lot of overlap between condition 2, mobility and migration, condition 7. So we combined them, and also between social capital and state intervention, which seemed to be overlapping or trading off with each other. So what we found, and that 91% of our cases, we found that these two, the environmental conditions or environmental stress, and a combination of both male migration and very poor working conditions for women, actually ended up dampening or negating women's agency. So we started with a positive question, but we actually then flipped our question to look at the combination of conditions that seem to be negating women's agency. So it's clearly climate crisis, I think, is a real crisis for gender equality as well. And I've spoken about this elsewhere, that with climate justice, gender justice, these go together, because we found across the study that where there was environmental stress, where there was climate stress, it was having a negative effect on women's agency. And I'll just explain in a minute why. Then we found that apart with these two common conditions, there were two different alternate configurations or pathways that led to a decline in women's condition. One was, of course, poverty. That negative material condition of poverty was a dampener. And the second is a very interesting institutional pathway, which is the trade-off between social capital or community level and state interventions. So environmental stress and women's poor working conditions are common factors that depress women's agency. And these are just some of the ways in which they do it. In terms of male absence, women take on additional responsibilities in agriculture. They have total responsibility for household maintenance. They often get indebted. They are very highly stressed. Many women whom I found in Kenya actually engage with risky ventures like sex trade or selling illegal, drugs and intoxicants and so on. In Kenya, I also found that it was a pastoral group as men move away because of drought to places where they can find pasture and water. Women actually used to sell the milk and then get income out of it. But once the cattle are far away, then women also lose this access to this income. And also with droughts and extreme events, we found a decline in local wages. So women are left behind, but the wages also decline badly. So there is a feminization of the rural, but decision-making remains in male hands. So in terms of first institutional pathways, I think this was very interesting that state interventions and social capital often substitute for each other. So even though there's a lot of positive laws in affirmative action and affirmative legislation across these contexts, but we found in these hotspots that whenever there is a disaster or an extreme event and relief has to be distributed, it always goes into men's hands. So also extension and financial services, and women rely on their male relatives to fulfill these needs. A lot of social protection measures and legal provisions are not properly implemented, which we also saw right now during the COVID pandemic as people lost their work. It was a disaster, but a lot of this was not really, levels of indebtedness have increased like anything in rural India, as also has consumption declined by almost 50%. In terms of social capital, again, with men migrating, I think this has disrupted a lot of the social networks, because particularly in patrilineal and patrilocal societies, men maintain these networks, kinship relations, associations, and so on. So this seems to reduce community cohesion. You have a lot of women who are gathered together in self-help groups and so on. Potentially, it can have an empowering effect, but there is a lack of capacity, there's a lack of skills, there's a lack of money that flows into these self-help groups, which really makes it very difficult for these women. They about survive, but it really makes it difficult for them to adapt in a longer term, sustainable sense. And the second factor pathway, as I said, is household poverty. What was very interesting here, that we often blame the household. We say patriarchy, men are controlling women and so on. But what we found is that actually with climate crisis in these hotspots, a lot of favorable changes have taken place in terms of household structure, headship, mobility. In Kenya, because the men are away for long periods of time, the women are actually living with other women relatives. It's called matrifocality. And there's a nuclearization where there's less control. Women have greater decision-making. They're coming into the labor markets. They're earning incomes. They have obviously greater role and voice in household decisions. But here it is really poverty. You look at extreme poverty in this case of a woman selling drugs. This is a mira, it is an intoxicant. That poverty is reflected here in low levels of education, poor health, very high levels of indebtedness, lack of food security, and very few productive assets, which really go against women's agency. They work very hard, but they're not really able to improve their condition. We found a few cases of what we call of positive women's agency. This was this balanced 9%, which is the logical contradictions. And these were very interesting. And I think it goes back to my point about how do we understand agency and the whole issue of intersectionality, looking at women's positions. We found women entrepreneurs in Kenya. They're in the urban context. They're from better off families, so they have greater opportunities for entrepreneurship. In Mali, rural communities, they live in multi-generational households. They're also polygamous. So older women here have much more agency to control and distribute food and work, while the younger women don't have this. So when we talk about positive women's agency, it's really referring to the older women. Similarly, in Nepal, one of the cases was a cooperative which provided livestock to women, and this led to an increase in outcomes, an improvement in outcomes for them. So I want to conclude with what are some of the implications that we found from this study for policy and practice. I think environmental stress is clearly a depressor to women's agency. And this is one reason that the women's movement has been also very active in the climate justice movement and in calling for the climate crisis to be acknowledged. And for net zero, I think the women's constituency is very active in this because it really affects them very fundamentally. So making institutional support, I think, has come out as very key. So while we may talk about the private sector, markets, and so on, these remain very unequal and exploitative. They tend to privilege those with power, those with particular interests. And this is where the role of states, the role of is very important in terms of providing basic services, in terms of providing infrastructure to enable agency. One other thing that we found is that here, that in order to provide not just effective social protection is needed, but one thing is that universal social protection. And I think this is something in India too, we have been arguing that certain things need to be universal, because we found otherwise that it can, like in the case of Namibia, that the state provides some targeted benefits, and this tends to create competition between individuals and households rather than cooperative or collective action by targeting resources narrowly. And of course, this whole issue of work and labor markets and, wage differentials and poor working conditions is very important, and decent work. And I don't know in this globalized world how we can really improve regulation. And I think in India too, there has been a lot of debate around labor codes, particularly during the pandemic, when there was a lot of relaxation of labor codes because of the pandemic, and actually a denial of labor rights. And many countries did this. Mauritius, which is dependent on migrant labor, it said that there will be no worker protection because we just have to somehow manage to run our factories during the pandemic. But this really creates also a problem, this race to the bottom, as we call in terms of labor markets. And finally, I think the diverse voices, I think the diversity, which goes back to my point about science, that, science, if you really recognize that there are diverse constituencies, then if you really want to use science for public good, then we have to take account of diverse voices in terms of formulating adaptation plans, not just a few men. And I think that's my last slide, that we're not just talking about a better common future, but also we want a better common present, I think, even for ourselves, not just for future generations. And I think this really, given the power of science, it really creates all of us, whether you're from hard sciences, natural sciences, or social sciences, that we have to be active citizens, because the voice of scientists actually is central to the struggles for equality, to break some of the gender myths that would deny women human dignity. We have to break this culture of silence. While scientific leaders are clearly important, I think we also need to break the dichotomy or the binary between sort of science and community or tradition or indigenous. I think there are many women and men at the local level whom I would call invisible scientists. I've worked with them. They have lots of insight into soils, into crops, into pests. And I think we really need to look at this seriously and work together to improve everyday lives of human beings. We need a more holistic approach to the environment and to people, which has an element of distributive justice, or the distribution of equitable distribution of resources. And finally, I think for us in educational institutions and academic institutions, I think we really need to imbibe not just the technicalities and the modalities, but also the spirit and principles of science. So it is not just men or women, but it is those in power who need to actually question some of the social and gender inequalities. So I think as a feminist, it's not just women who are feminists, but I think anybody, a lot of men who support the movement. I think Gandhi, I think many of these people were very Mandela were very central to the movement for justice, because it's really a questioning at the end of the day of unequal power hierarchies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nitya. It's a wonderful presentation. And what personally I, towards the end, you mentioned Gandhi, which is a deep concern for me, somewhere like a deep connect with the entire this thing, and not just about the issues of equity and justice, but also the way you thought of the local knowledge. And that is something which is part of my ongoing interest, having worked on Kumarappa. So it was really fascinating, and the way you connected your personal journey with your academic interest and the work which you are currently doing. Thank you so much. I think the presentation is now open for discussion. Uh, some, I think, have typed the question. What I'll do now is, I think I'll close the meeting and I'll unmute people. So unmute the participants so that they can speak in the mic. Please. Okay, so I've
Can I ask a question?
yes,
Chatra?
Shalini.
Hi, Nitya. Lovely to see
Hi.
you. And this talk was amazing. I joined a bit late, so I'm not sure, you might have already spoken about those elements also. But I was just wondering, like, I mean, in your this research case studies with different contexts that you spoke about, did you also notice how the mental health or the emotional well-being of women is linked with the issue of climate change and the anxieties that it generates?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think somebody else has also put a question around psychology and so on, and emotional well-being. So I think absolutely. I mean, if we go back to the four principles which I talked about earlier, I think in terms of reciprocity, redistribution, recognition, and representation, I think one thing is that women, I think when they're left to sort of manage on their own, I think this is also quite stressful because they have to put the food on the table. There is no assistant. They have to go to the field. They have to do the domestic work. They have to go to the money lender or the local dukan or shop to get whatever. And of course, this is not just stress, but it is also, I think, missing the reciprocal relationships in the absence of the other elements as well. So absence of representation, for instance, and voice. I mean, it was very interesting in some of this work, but also in some of other work in UP. I found that when we're migrating from Banaras to Surat or Gujarat, they actually, because of this great uncertainty in the local level, which some women confronted, they were not having Kisan credit cards. They could not go to the bank. They did not have membership in cooperative societies. Actually, the men were leaving their ATM cards with their wives when they went to Surat, and they would deposit the money there and then say ki jab tumko zarurat hai, nikal lena. So I think that sense actually gives that sense of that somebody is there, that there is some reciprocity in the relationship, even if it's not equal in terms of physical work. And I think the two are linked because I think with the climate hotspots, particularly, the physical work burden is so high that, I think there is also a problem of lack of rest, lack of leisure, and just tiredness, physical health, apart, of course, from issues of mental and emotional health.
Can I speak a few words, please?
Yes, please go ahead.
Sure, please.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I am speaking from Himachal Pradesh. So I am a forest officer and IFS officer in the state and heading the department. We have many projects which are going on, and I have worked with many US projects, then Norway project, and there are so many projects. But the experiences which I want to share here with you all is usually in the initial stages, what is happening? The women do not take part in the activities, say forest activities or the livelihood activities. But with the passage of time, if we try to involve them, and gradually they are the person who come large in number than anybody else. It is the way we take. But what I wanted to convey you all is that the women, the household livelihood, and the economy of the household or the entire family depends of families, women, which is an integral part of the household, because they go to the forest, collect the fodder, they go and graze their cattle, they collect grasses, and in Madhya Pradesh and other area, they go and collect the tendu leaves also. And they bring the fuel wood fodder to the house, and by virtue of which we get a good amount of milk. But if the climate change prevails, as the temperature at the moment is 1.5, and the apprehensions of the UNCCF and other, now we are going to have a COP26 also, we have to restrict carbon emission to this way and create a sink tank, that is a forest. But the climate change will, there is apprehension that we are going to have a degradation process. That means the dependency of the family on the forest will be drastically affected. And it will be the family head, that is a woman, who will be most affected. So we have to take some research in this way, or develop a methodology so that the woman is taken care of, and what role she is going to play in the livelihood, that adaptation part remains with her. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a really important point. And I think that also links to the resources, recognition of resources and the redistribution of resources. Because I think you're absolutely right about forests. Forests are being degraded. Common property is being degraded. It is being used for other purposes. And this, of course, is an important livelihood resource on which women depend. And the option then becomes to go to the labor market. And the labor market is very unequal for women. I have seen even recently, before this present lockdown, I was in Tamil Nadu 2 months ago, that some of the women actually, they are doing 20 years ago or 10 years ago, I saw women doing home-based work from the Tirupur factories, removing thread from the cloth, from waste cloth, for 10 or 20 rupees a kilo, and still they are doing that work for 10 or 20 rupees a kilo. So I think it is, and it takes a couple of hours. So I think still women are very much at the bottom end of invisible work, unpaid work, very poor working conditions, no protective gear. And for everything, whether it is, and the land has been alienated, as you said correctly, their forests have been alienated. We are not really thinking about it. And with climate, I think we find, what has been called climate refugees, or a lot of migrants to urban areas to work in the slums, to work as rickshaw pullers or whatever it is. In some cases, whole families move. In some cases, only men move. And that's why I said that from a gender lens, and when we think about gender equality, actually, even migrant men is an area of concern in this research that we did, or young men. Because we found that actually in India, for instance, if you look at the National Institute of Nutrition data for the last 30 years, that in central tribal areas in central India, the dietary diversity of men has reduced at a faster rate and is poorer than that of tribal women. And partly this is because that women are still in the villages, somehow managing, doing very hard work, as you pointed out, with the forest and with the land, but at least they have access to some fruits or some greens or something like that from the local resources. The men who are migrant to the brick kilns or to construction work, they basically just have plain rice, maybe with some chilies or with some tamarind. And this has really contributed to a decline in also male health over the last 20, 30 years. So I think these are linked. And I think thank you for raising this very important point.
Okay.
Hi, Chaitra. I have a question.
Yes, Mamita, please.
Yeah. Many thanks, Professor Nitya. A wonderful talk, very insightful one. So you were mentioning about Madame Curie's case, right? When with the criticism in her personal relationships, and this is still existent. in our professions, right? And this leads to a marginalization of women in their professional career and hampers their professional career. Now, when we talk about betterment of working environment for us and for future generations, what do you think? How do we address this kind of a critical problem?
Yeah. So I think this is where I think the change has to take place, across levels. I think we need some kind of reinforcement from different levels. So for instance, in the SDGs, the goal 5 on equality, gender equality, and 5.4 is about redistribution of unpaid care work. Now, what does it mean? I mean, you can't enforce it, but I think this is about societal change, about reciprocity, that how can we start that without saying that, okay, people have to do, there's a law, the danda, 50-50 for everything. It may not work like that, but how do we ensure that there is a shared distribution of work? What are the incentives? I mean, one of the reasons that women also drop out of their careers and stay at home is because of children and the domestic responsibility, but also because as a household, if you think of the household, the salaries that the men can get in the labor markets are much higher than what women can get even till now. I think the WHO report of last year, 2019, it showed pre-pandemic that within the whole health workers, a large number of women, but the wage gap in the whole health services, that the men are the top, the doctors, and then the lower, even now, I think we have seen during the pandemic, ASHA workers, no protective gear, no extra incentives, and they are being made to do COVID duty night and day. So I know ASHA workers, girls who have worked with me in the Santhal Parganas, they get nothing. They get paid only for number of institutional deliveries, number of immunization, and all that has been on hold. So basically they're working for free. And so this is the inequality of the workforce. So if the husband gets a job, then there is every likelihood that why will the wife not want to stay at home and enjoy the children and do this kind of totally, unrewarded, unrecognized, unappreciated work? So I think this is an issue with scientific careers. Now, if one thing, I'm not propagating it, but this is a balance that we need to get within our society, which respects and reciprocates and redistributes. This is very important. You see, you look at the West, England, where I work, has also gone through in our academic field. If I talk about, that a lot of academics, of course, get married to other academics. And then in a couple of years, they have children. The men really progress. They become professors, they get promotions, and the women are left behind. And after about 10 years or so, I'm just saying, I have not done research, but this is just observation, that there is a lot of problem or kind of upheaval even within the marriage or within the marital relationship. In some cases, they're able to renegotiate. In some cases where they can't renegotiate, there's also a splitting up that takes place. I think if you look at the UK statistics, the divorce rate is something like 30% or something like that. So quite high. And I think, so this is something that how do we reach? So that's not the ideal. I don't think women are looking to be on their own, nor are men looking to be on their own. But I think this is a process of social churning whereby we can reach some kind of a reciprocal, and respectful relationship towards each other. So there's no easy answer, but I think this MIT study, I think if you get a chance to watch the movie, it got an Oscar, the movie on the scientist, which I mentioned, the MIT study, which has been screened by Picture a Scientist, which is about these women scientists in MIT. But I think it was beautifully done, and it really shows, how they put together evidence right from this per square feet space, that office space of women and men. Women's office space was about half of men's office space, and they're all senior, biologists, other disciplines, the lab space. So I think starting with very, very practical, of course, sexual harassment was when you go for field trips is a big issue. That how do you deal with sexual harassment? And I think that MIT film basically talks about that one very powerful person who was bringing in a lot of money to the university, very well-known scientist, but who had really harassed many of these women. And I think it was only 2018-19 when a lot of these things actually came to the fore and women were able to speak up with the Me Too campaign and things like that. So I think there are many levels of constraint in terms of, women's bodies, women's, the physical spaces, the responsibilities, and these occur across institutions. So you may have a very supportive family, but, your institution may be discriminatory. So this is what I was trying to convey, that just focusing on one level is not enough if you want to make change. Right. So like now, actually, in many rural households, I see much greater cooperation, especially in the context of climate hotspots, because they have to cooperate to survive. So men and women have to cooperate with each other in order to survive. But then there are too many constraints in the labor market. There's too many constraints vis-a-vis government. Hum isko denge, usko nahi denge. So-and-so's name is written, so-and-so's name is not written. The Aadhaar card is matching or not matching. So this then becomes huge constraint for people. And that is why I said that one of the things is to really universalize when we are talking about, basic needs and basic infrastructure. One has to really, if you're thinking about humanity or if you're thinking about public good, we have to reduce the number of barriers we put in a person's pathway. Because there will always be struggles. But, if you're struggling at all sides, at all times, this becomes a very difficult battle, to win. And this is why our study showed that, we started off with a positive question about what are the factors that facilitate women's agency. But we had to flip it around, because with climate crisis, everything seemed to be, actually going in the opposite direction, except for 4 cases out of the 25.
All right, thank you.